Hello and welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This is a women-only webinar. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we are offering this series of webinars here. Enjoy. Today, we're joined by Sandra McNeil, who's going to be talking about the book Women Against Violence Against Women, but also about other work that's been done on child sexual abuse. So I'll hand over to Sandra.
Good morning. Hilary Saltburn was the main organizer of this conference, which was called Male Power and the Sexual Abuse of Girls, and was held in Manchester in 1982. She couldn't be with us, but she and I had a discussion. And what she says is that she'd been to the other two WAVOL conferences, as I think of them, Sexual Violence Against Women in Leeds in 1980 and Women Against Violence Against Women in London 1981. And the idea for this conference, Male Power and the Sexual Abuse of Girls, came out of Manchester rape crisis. They were the main organisers, but they also had links with Manchester Women's Aid and Taboo, the incest survivors group. When Manchester rape crisis began in 1981, they were expecting calls from women who had been recently raped. They were not prepared for the high number of calls from women who wanted to talk about being sexually abused as children. This came as a shock to them, and they felt they were not equipped to deal with these calls. They thought it was a scandalous situation that this issue had not had enough discussion in the women's liberation movement. So that's how they set about planning the conference. They met at the Gay Centre where Lesbian Link was based, and Hilary commented that at the time, all these groups were working well together. So I'll just read a little bit for the flyer for the conference. It is overwhelmingly girls who are sexually abused and men who are the abusers. As feminists, how can we tackle this issue so central to women's oppression? How can we help women or girls who have suffered it or are suffering it? Before we can begin to answer these and other questions, we need to bring the subject out into the open and talk about it. From the first paper for the conference written by Hilary. Now that we are starting to tackle rape as an issue, something concerning many women is the lack of action around or even a real recognition of the sexual abuse of girls by trusted men. Sexual assault of girls by men in authority over them, particularly fathers or fathers figures, is extremely widespread and has terrible and long-lasting effects. Susan Forward, speaking of the USA, estimates that 1 in 10 women have been molested by a male relative or similar figure. And like rape, the figure could actually be much higher. The taboo on speaking out about incestuous assault is enormous. All the reasons for keeping quiet about sexual assault are there, with many more besides. The girl currently suffering such assault will probably be confused about what's happening and unable to know what's normal and what isn't. She will probably not want to risk telling another adult and being disbelieved. After all, her friends and relatives will be his, and adult power is not easily challenged by a child. Her father, stepfather, or whatever will also very likely warn her against telling anyone by use of lies, threats, promises, and so on. And if a woman, years later, does dare talk about assaults in her childhood, the response is very likely to be disbelieved based on her silence up till now. Keep that in mind when I start talking later about Cleveland, just the second thing I'm going to talk about. So I talked to Hilary about the conference and I said, what came out of it? She said, it helped all of us in rape crisis centres in our work. It strengthened our knowledge and confidence. We put more emphasis on abuse in families when we gave talks, and we had increased contact with other groups like incest survivors. Many rape crisis centres in this country renamed themselves rape and incest survivor support groups. The Manchester rape crisis kept its original name, but it did also look at incest survival. She says, in our group, there were lots of professionals, nurses, a doctor, social workers, academics, and there was interplay between their professional lives and what they were learning in rape crisis. So it was influential right across the city. And she says the conference was influential because of highlighting this issue, child sexual abuse, from a feminist point of view. That's the end of the good news in my talk this morning. I'm now going to talk about Cleveland, 1987. Now, those of you of my age will remember Cleveland, though perhaps you won't recognize its significance. Maybe others of you won't have heard it. So I'll start by saying, where is Cleveland? Cleveland was a county. It's been dissolved now. It was just short of the River Tees. So the main town was Middlesbrough, Redcar, and Saltburn at the posher end. But before I talk about Cleveland, which the scandal took place in 1987, I'm going to go back 2 years and talk about Leeds. Now, in Leeds, there was a woman called Jane Wynne, whom I knew. I mean, not as a friend, I knew her from various committees I was on. She was the senior paediatrician at Leeds St. James Hospital. And she had developed, I'm going to have to say this a few times, the reflex anal dilation test. Anal rape is how most men abuse children, small children, and buggery. We're talking about buggery. If buggery is repeated, the child's anus will gape open if the child's laid down on the child's side. It's a kind of self-protection from harm. It will just gape open because it's expecting a penis to be entering. This is not normal. It is a sign of child abuse. So having developed this, Jane Wynne worked in collaboration with the West Yorkshire Police. They began investigating cases of child sexual abuse and had begun a large number of prosecutions in Leeds, successful prosecutions. Jane Wynne also taught colleagues how to look for this sign of child sexual abuse, including Dr. Marietta Higgs, who moved to Cleveland in 1987. Jane Wynne said to me later, she wished she had taught them the importance of getting the police on board, as well as looking for the sign, though reading about the police in Cleveland, it probably wouldn't have worked anyway. However, Dr. Marietta Higgs arrived in Cleveland, and with her colleague, Dr. Jeff Wyatt, they started finding signs of child sexual abuse, signs of buggery. Now, they only used this reflex anal dilation test when there were other concerns that alerted them that there might be child sexual abuse. The way it was later described in the papers, you could have gone in with, a sore arm or tonsillitis, and they were routinely testing all children for this. They weren't. They were only testing the children where they thought there was a sign of child sexual abuse. But they were finding this sign and letting the police know. Now, this is key. The police refused to investigate. The police in Cleveland absolutely refused to investigate any of the cases. They had some backup from their own police surgeons who said that, Having a gaping anus was quite normal. It meant nothing. They'd seen it for years. I think as professionals, they didn't want to realize they'd been missing a sign of sexual abuse. But whatever, they told the police, yeah, you don't need to worry about it. And the police were already not cooperating with other professionals. So they refused to investigate. Next step, what could social services do? They had these diagnoses of child sexual abuse. The police were refusing to investigate, saying it meant nothing. What could they do? They took the children into care. At one point, 121 children were removed from home and put in care. That's quite a lot from a small town like Middlesbrough and the area. The parents of the children met and formed an action group. Now, because of the area being Middlesbrough, most of the children were working class, but some of them were middle class and they knew how to organise. They went to the MP, Stuart Bell, and he started shouting about middle class professionals having witch hunts breaking up working class families. The parents went to the press, and the press took the same line. National scandal. What was the government going to do? Everyone was asking. The government ordered a very limited inquiry into it, headed by Judge Elizabeth Butler Sloss. And a lot of us feminists had been following this, and we were waiting for the outcome. The press were all predicting that the report would discredit the anal dilation test. It didn't. It vindicated it. So you would expect the report to blame the police, because if the test was correct and the police were doing nothing, there should be changes in the police, changes in police practice. No, the report blamed the other professionals, the doctors for carrying on diagnosis, social services for taking them into care, and gave the impression it was their fault. Well, it blighted their careers. And I was discussing it with John Hanmer, and we just could not understand it. We were completely baffled. We were completely baffled that the report could vindicate the test and then not blame the police. So the outcome of that report was to encourage a myth that no child had been abused. It was a moral panic. It had broken up innocent families. And it certainly put a stop to any further investigations. 20 years later, I joined the domestic violence team in Leeds City Council, which was then part of what was called community safety. And there were police officers there who had been around at the time. So I asked them how badly Cleveland had affected investigating and prosecuting child sexual abuse. And they said, it has never recovered. I'm now going to talk about B. Campbell's books. B. Campbell has written 2 books about Cleveland. The first one, Unofficial Secrets, in 1988, was almost immediately after the scandal. And more recently, in 2023, she wrote Secrets and Silence, Uncovering the Legacy of the Cleveland Child Sexual Abuse Case. B. Campbell now says that she thought when she wrote the original book that the government and the inquiry had decided to not know about the extent of the problem of child sexual abuse. But since then, she has discovered dossiers and correspondence between the DHSS and the Treasury showing that it was known, but covered up. Here's a quote. The doctor's diagnosis were correct in at least 80% of cases. The Treasury regarded this as dangerous territory. because it would attract demand for extra resources. And this was at the start of Thatcherism. So the inquiry was a cover-up. Why did it not point at the police and lack of action and say what the police should do? Because it was intended as containment and to shut down the national conversation about child abuse. Now, B. Campbell is very careful, and she always was very careful, and she's very careful in this book about what she says and doesn't say. She quotes an interview that someone had done with Lady Elizabeth Butler Sloss, the judge who carried out the inquiry, where she is asked, whose idea was it for this particular inquiry? And she says, oh, I think it was my brother's. Her brother was Michael Havers, the Lord Chancellor, a member of the government and head of the judiciary. He also said it should be headed by a woman judge. There were only 3 and the other 2 were busy, so I guess it was me. So the government had set the parameters of the report. However, the report she produced was still too controversial. So only a short summary was published. B. Campbell again says, the full report was not published. Key sections were removed as intolerable to a government determined to shrink the welfare state. And Thatcher was definitely determined to shrink the welfare state. She famously said, there is no such thing as society. This had concerned many, but we should also be concerned that she went on to say, there's no such thing as society, only individual men and women and families. B. Campbell's book, 2023, Secrets and Silence, which I recommend, shows how Cleveland was the start of the backlash. In the 1980s, I was working in the domestic violence field, and I was delighted at the adoption of a document called Working Together, which I think was co-written by feminist Marianne Hester. It said clearly, where there is child abuse, look for domestic violence. Where there is domestic violence, look for child abuse. Now that policy document was introduced by Labour. They didn't back it with any extra resources, I have to say, but it was their document, and it was clearly not going to be acceptable to the Tories, who then came in. B. Campbell says the 1980s was the heroic age of awareness of child sexual abuse. After Cleveland, it was all about keeping families together. No looking for signs. Quote, if children are abused, they will tell. Something we had known for years was not true. And this way of thinking was embodied in the Children Act, 1989. So no looking for domestic violence where there's child abuse, look for child abuse when there's domestic violence, no looking for child sexual abuse at all. And also from my memory, this was when we began to hear from the group Families Need Fathers, which succeeded in having it established. The presumption was that it's in the child's best interest to always have contact with both parents, even if the woman has left due to the man's violence. I mean, I met women who went to jail because they refused to let their children have contact with the violent man. And then they found the children were taken into care and given contact with the man, so that didn't help. And more recently, we've had fake experts giving evidence about a fake syndrome called parental alienation syndrome. That's when the child is really clear about not wanting to see dad. It's because mum has infected them with parental alienation syndrome. Therefore, dad should get the child. And before that, of course, we had false memory syndrome. This was the one where abusers, with experts, said that adults who had any kind of therapy were not remembering child sexual abuse. They had false memories implanted by the therapists. So successful was this approach with juries that this led to rape victims, even young children, being denied therapy. The police said, if you take them to therapy or if you go to therapy, we'll drop the case because it won't win. So you have a choice. You have a prosecution or you have help for yourself and your child. That changed slightly after one boy died. He killed himself because he had been denied therapy, which therapists said would have helped him. And it took a long while for the case to happen. He killed himself. So there was some relaxing about therapy after that. But right up to date, there are still problems with it because counselling notes can be demanded by the defence. Now, some of you might wonder why that's a problem, but that's because you've never been on a helpline at rape crisis. I mean, we all know from when we're 2 years old that women are to blame for rape. We've always known it. And women who've been raped or sexually abused as children, we learn it too. And whatever we might say to our friends and families, when we get on the rape crisis helpline, it was my fault. I should have known better. I shouldn't have this. I shouldn't have got in the car. It's what you hear all the time on rape crisis lines. And we reassure them. We've always reassured them, no, it's not your fault, it's his fault. And I guess that's what they want to hear us saying. But imagine if we took notes and we gave that to the defence. So we have to be very careful about notes. So all this has been part of a backlash against the feminist gains that we made in Women Against Violence Against Women in those conferences in the 80s. We've had this backlash. I'm going to make 2 more points before I throw it open. The first one is a warning about Wikipedia. Now, we all know the editors on Wikipedia are anti-feminist. You just need to look at anything, particularly feminist, whether it's Guerrilla Girls or Sheila Jeffries, and you can see what they've written in Wikipedia. So we know not to trust it when it's about feminism, but of course we do use it. So when I started to write an article about this, I turned to Wikipedia for the basic facts. And I found Wikipedia said, the Butler-Sloss inquiry concluded that most of the diagnoses were incorrect. You look up the anal dilation test and it says in Wikipedia, it was discredited during the inquiry and is now totally discredited. That's not true. There's books by B. Campbell. So I went on Wikipedia to B. Campbell's page and looked at her book list. It omits the Cleveland books on Wikipedia. I thought, I bet they've never heard of Dr. Jane Wynne. So I went to Dr. Jane Wynne, got her obituary, and it says very clearly that the inquiry supported her methods on that test. So they hadn't yet got to Dr. Jane Wynne, but they got to B. Campbell and they got to the Cleveland scandal. So they're anti-feminists and they're also child abusers as far as I'm concerned. So watch out for Wikipedia. Always check original documents. Right. Right. So fight back. We need to fight back and continue the fight back. And I just want to point out something I'm sure we all know, that however much there has been a backlash, before the women's liberation movement, things were much worse. In spite of the backlash, in this area, as everywhere else, it was never went back to being as bad as before the women's liberation movement. Before the women's liberation movement, the authority on child sexual abuse was Freud. Now, when Freud started practicing, in the 1890s, he had a number of mainly women came to him for therapy. And it turned out they had all been sexually abused by their fathers. Now, there are women who've been sexually abused by their fathers who lead perfectly good lives, perfectly good feminists, very successful lives. And, it doesn't damage you necessarily forever, but it's not a good start in life for most people. It isn't. So it wasn't surprising that these women were looking for help. And Freud wrote a paper with these astonishing findings in it, saying how common it was, which went down in Vienna like a lead balloon. It was ruining his reputation. What could he do? So he went away and had a think. He had a eureka moment. They were all lying. They hadn't been sexually abused by their fathers. They wanted sex with their fathers. It was a fantasy because they all fantasized about having sex with their fathers when they were children. And that formed the basis of Freud's theory of infantile sexuality, whereby all small children want sex with their opposite sex parents. That's the basis of Freud's theory. It made him very successful once he started saying that. In the 1970s, it was New York radical feminists who first called Freud out. Florence Rush, in a paper, called him out. And then, gradually men started saying it too, and Freud was discredited. Up till then, women who said they'd been abused as children were automatically disbelieved by all therapists. So, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We must, can't say continue in their footsteps because that's a mixed metaphor. But yes, we're not starting from as far back as the original radical feminists. We are starting quite far on. But yes, we have to start fighting back again and recovering child sexual abuse. And the things that we'd said in this book around male violence against women and about child sexual abuse, they're as true today as when we wrote them there. And we need to start getting that out again and reclaiming the issue from a feminist point of view.
Thank you, Sandra. Excuse me, I'll come on as well, and maybe Sheila might want to chip in as well as somebody else that knows about the subject. I'll just see if I can get her on as a participant as well. Yeah, I mean, I was struck reading the section about the 1982 conference about, yeah, that the arguments are the same. The arguments from us and the arguments from the opposition. You can see it playing out in the recent grooming gangs thing about sort of blaming the girls for their own abuse. Seeing them as bad girls who wanted it rather than as victims, and the whole denial from the professionals. But what you've said about Cleveland has made me slightly skeptical about inquiries. I hope this one finally does the job that all the inquiries have supposed to have done and actually hold some people to account. So anyway, if anyone's got any questions, do put them in the chat and we can pass them on. Do you want to add anything, Sheila?
Can I make a comment? I was interested in what Sandra was saying about how it was Manchester rape crisis that started saying incest was very important and hadn't been talked about, and we needed to work on incest. And I have to say that in Leeds rape crisis, which I got involved with in 1978, I think it very recently been set up, we certainly were talking in 1978, 79 about incest. There's no question about that. And we actually did little sessions. In the training sessions for the women who were going to go on the line, we would ask questions about, for instance, in relation to incest, and we did train ourselves on that, about the children's mothers, because nobody was talking about the devastating effect upon mothers. In fact, mothers were frequently being blamed in all the professional literature. They must have known, they wouldn't do anything about it. And we thought mothers were a big category of women who needed support. And so we tried to train ourselves about that. And still, of course, there's very little about the mothers, although I do know quite a few mothers, even in my friend network, whose children were sexually abused. They didn't know until their children eventually told them, often when they were young adults, about what had happened to them. And it's devastating for those mothers. But the important thing is that we were certainly thinking about that, about the issue. And indeed, at that time, I went up to Leeds in 1978 to do research on child sexual abuse. That was my topic and my target. It's the work which became Spinster and Her Enemies, my first book. So in 1978, I was researching child sexual abuse. And when I started, I wanted to look at what was happening at the time, contemporaneous child sexual abuse, not the history. So I actually put a notice in the newspaper in Leeds asking women who'd experienced child sexual abuse to write to me. I mean, it's an incredibly bold thing to do, really, at the time. And I got, I think, about 9 letters from women, all different kinds of responses, which is extraordinary. I don't think I was very good at being a researcher at that time. You'd have to have all sorts of ethics and do it in a very different way now, I think. But at that time, that's what I did. In the end, I didn't choose to look at contemporaneous child sexual abuse, although I wrote about all the dreadful literature that you've been talking about, blaming the children, blaming the wives, blaming the mothers. I was terribly shocked to discover all of that. But in the end, I chose to look at the history and women's campaign against child sexual abuse, feminist campaigns in the late 19th and early 20th century, which led to the 1908 Incest Act, Punishment of Incest Act, and so on. So feminists were incredibly exercised on this issue back then, incredibly exercised. And they were talking in those days about how, if children had been sexually abused, they needed to have women in the courtroom. This led to the beginnings of women's police, so that the girl children could sit on a woman's lap to talk about what had happened to her and so on. They were doing huge amount of work in the late 19th, early 20th century. And of course, all that disappeared. We didn't know anything about any of that. So it's not surprising, I think, that all of the tremendous work that you were talking about here really was sort of pushed out of consciousness. And still, the lessons have not been done. Still, there is no seriousness about child sexual abuse, as you've been pointing out. And all of that work has gone. I mean, the analysis in Women Against Violence Against Women is so advanced, and we really haven't come further than that. Do you think we've made advances, that there are any new understandings beyond what was in that book?
No, I mean it's all the same headings that that you're talking about. It's men that do it and girls they do it to. Child sexuality is a red herring. That's a reference to the paedophile information exchange. Coercion is coercion, whether or not violence is used. Mothers are not the ones to blame, and the effects can be profound and long-lasting. I don't think we've come beyond that.
No.
But it all got covered up, and it was all about keeping families together, and that's what it's been right up to now.
One of the things we were talking about, like right before, was there's Ancestry and all these companies now that will look at your DNA and tell you, it's like, oh, you have a relative in northern Germany, or you have a cousin here, and it's people that you've never heard of. And what they've found out is that if you go back and say I have a cousin wherever, you go back a few generations, and an adult had a consanguineous relationship, in other words, sexually abused a child, who is a relative that I didn't know I had. So that there is now a realization that this is so common, because there are so many incidences that are being found of adults having sex with children, resulting in cousins that people didn't know they had. And it's not just a here and there, it's apparently fairly widespread. And the thing that I did a rotation once in college and in a family court system, and there was a social worker there who wanted to do research on what are the characteristics of men who sexually abuse their kids. And so she started collecting data, and she started trying to build a profile of they exhibit these behaviors, and these behaviors. And what she found is that when she went to go do it, it was like, well, but this is what men do, or men get accused of that, and it can't possibly be. So a lot of what allows this to be perpetuated repeatedly is just failure to recognize what men actually do, and to admit to it.
Yeah.
But I think that's also about trying to find something special about the men that do it, isn't it? Whereas one of the things that feminists sort of identified is that they're not monsters,
right.
They're not different, they're normal family, nice neighbors, or that sort of thing that you hear often said about men that murder their wives or children. Oh, but he was such a nice man. So you can't really, that's the whole point, isn't it? It can be any man. I think the only question we've had so far was about statistics, but I don't know whether anybody's sort of got those to hand. That's probably asking a bit much. But and then I guess the statistics are always unreliable anyway.
Can I just talk about the other sorts of backlash that we had in the 80s about all this extraordinary work that Sandra's been talking about on child sexual abuse? And there are two things that come to my mind. Obviously, the setting up of incest survivors groups by feminists was an extraordinary step forward of women taking things into their own hands. But what happened in the mid-1980s in Britain, and a bit earlier than that in the US, of course, is the development of the movement of sadomasochism, a cult of sadomasochism. And what happened was that incest survivors groups went into decline, but women who'd experienced child sexual abuse went into sadomasochism. And I can remember when going around and giving talks, as I did, against the development of sadomasochism and for a sexuality of equality back in the sort of mid to late 1980s. There would be young women in the audience who would say things like sadomasochism was crucial to them because in child sexual abuse, they'd set up barriers to protect themselves against feeling and against sexual response. And the only way they could have a sexual response was to be beaten, cut, or abused in a way that would break down the barrier so that they were able to have a sexual response. So they went to sadomasochism, which was, of course, a terrible backlash against what we as feminists had been trying to do, which was actually deal with the abuse instead of recycling it. And I would always say to them that doesn't end the effects of the abuse, it just recycles it, and the damage goes on and on and on. So I think sadomasochism was certainly a response, which was a backlash that stopped the progress we were making. But the other thing, I think, was the development of the movement of so-called feminist therapy. And an American feminist, Louise Armstrong, has written very well about this. She wrote one of the very first books on child sexual abuse, then called Incest, which was called Kiss Daddy Goodnight, a very, very, very important book. By the late 70s, she is shocked by and is writing a very different book called called Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, which is what we did, which is what Sandra was talking about. We rocked the cradle of sexual politics by bringing the issue of child sexual abuse into the open. So her book was called Rocking the Cradle of sexual politics, what happened when women said incest, which is what we're talking about. And she said what happened, and she was very, very angry about this, was the development of a huge feminist supposed therapy industry, particularly in the US, but it happened in other countries too, on the back of child sexual abuse, because women were very much going to women therapists to deal with child sexual abuse. And she was furious because she said this just dealt with the issue by setting the women who'd been sexually abused, by putting them back into, repairing them a bit and putting them straight back into the structures of male supremacy. Nothing was done about the abusers, about the abuse of children themselves. Instead, a therapy industry was set up which helped male supremacy by fitting these very harmed women back in. And I thought that's a very interesting response, because instead of seeing therapy as the answer in any way, it saw therapy as the problem. And I do remember back in the 1970s in Leeds Rape Crisis Group and in all the feminist work on child sexual abuse and rape in the UK at that time, we were very, very, very against therapy. And I can remember the point at which we became aware that London Rape Crisis Centre was actually putting women into therapy and directing women into therapy. We absolutely furiously did not wish to do that, because we thought that the only solution for women to the trauma that they'd been put into by child sexual abuse was to become feminists and fight back. We believed in that the best response was fighting back. We really hated the therapy. So it's interesting that Louise Armstrong sees that, or did see that, as one of the fundamental reasons why nothing was done about child sexual abuse, because the solution for the male state, for male supremacy, was making sure that all these women were in therapy. Then they weren't going to make trouble. They were fitted back into male supremacy and so on. So I think there were those two potential forces to undermine the sort of analysis and the sort of work that Sandra's been talking about, which is the development of the cult of sadomasochism for women to move into, and the development of the feminist therapy movement. So I think that it's very interesting to think of what were all of the forces involved in undermining the work we've been doing, hiding the work we've been doing, and so on.
And it's all designed really to allow the male behavior to continue. I don't know, Sandra, if in anything that you came across, little boys get sexually abused also. It's less common, and it's not talked about. And when it is, it's with an incredible horror that you don't hear and you don't see when it's girls being sexually abused. For some reason, somehow, it's so much worse. And it actually is truly a wrong, and it's terrible. And there's something wrong with the men who do it, which is why it's not talked about, and which is why men are so horrified when it does happen to little boys. But when it's happening to girls, it's really, I mean, it's just like, hey, it's business as usual. It happens. Guys don't really do that. You know, and you come up with a therapy movement that says, and, you know, when it does happen, we just have to help the little girls kind of get used to the fact that it happened and get over it. Whereas when it happens to little boys, A, either it didn't happen, and B, it's so horrifying, there really must be something wrong with the man. Men who sexually abuse girls are normal men. Men who sexually abuse boys, well, there's something wrong with them. And those are the guys that may wind up in therapy. But it's all revolving around men's sexual, you know, proclivities, appetites, you know, what they do, and how men can reasonably be expected to, you know, to relate to cute little girls. How, you know, it's just, it happens. And you know, I don't know. You were talking, Sheila, about a feminist movement, and until there's a feminist movement that absolutely will not excuse this kind of male behavior, my heart breaks for the fact that I don't think girls are going to be properly, properly cared for, and that this sort of thing is going to be prevented.
Mm.
Yes, and I think another thing about the therapy movement is that an important goal of that therapy movement was to ensure that these girls could be penetrated by men again. Because one of the problems that the sexually abused girls had was that they absolutely didn't want anything to do sexually with men, or found it very, very difficult to be involved with them. So the therapy movement had to be there to ensure that the girls were slotted back in and they became women who were routinely and obediently penetrated. Right? And that's kind of shocking to think about too, that something that feminist therapists would be doing is making sure that girls who had every reason to stay away from men for the rest of their lives were obediently penetrated for the rest of their lives instead.
Yeah, we've got a question, and it says it's a question for Sheila. Can there be feminist therapy, in inverted commas, for the women victims of sexual abuse? Is there such a thing as feminist therapy?
I have, and I have written about this, huge problems with the notion of therapy itself, the very idea of therapy, which was, I can remember back in 1977, I wrote a paper which went into Spare Rib magazine called Therapy or Consciousness Raising, Reform or Revolution, and gave all the reasons why therapy was actually counter-revolutionary. But a lot of people were saying that at that time. There was an anti-therapy, anti-psychology, anti-psychoanalytic movement, which was very critical. And those of us who were on the left at that time, and I think it's reasonable to say that as feminists we were very, very critical of therapy and what it was supposed to do and how anti-revolutionary it was. If you're asking me what is the right thing to be doing with women who've experienced child sexual abuse now, I don't think that I'm in a position to say that in precise terms. I can only really talk about the general, and I know this might seem like a cop-out, the general rejection of therapy that we had at that time. But I guess I probably would take the position that Celia Kitzinger took in her wonderful anti-therapy book, where she says that, if there's a situation of extreme distress, then one might have to think about ways to help women that don't fit in with one's immediate political analysis. So I know it might seem like a cop-out, but we certainly need to be having the discussion about whether therapy is a good idea at all at this time. But it's probably a slightly bigger discussion than we're able to have right now and in this situation.
Yeah. I mean, rape crisis centres now offer counselling. So is counselling different from therapy? I mean, I'm not any expert in this, but
that's a very good question, and I don't actually see the difference. I mean, back in the 1970s, everybody was getting into things like co-counseling, where you're supposed to sit down with your best friend and do counseling between you and all kinds of stuff. Now, I don't think there's really a difference between counseling and therapy, and many of the critiques that we had of therapy then, and I still have, are that it's privatizing, it cuts you off from your friends and other sources of support with somebody who's supposedly an expert, and why the hell are they? And often they don't even have any qualifications or whatever to be so, and so on and so on. There are many, many reasons why therapy, counseling are problematic, but of course they developed out of a society in which we are very individualistic and cut off from each other, whereas as feminists we tried to get together as groups and be with other women and develop ideas in consciousness raising and so on. Therapy and counseling are completely the opposite of that, of course.
Yeah.
The other thing that's very disturbing is this movement towards reconciliation. You're supposed to be reconciled with the person who abused you, with a criminal who was violent towards you, with someone who did terrible, awful things to do. You're supposed to sit down and talk to them and see them as people, and perhaps even forgive them. And this whole, reconciliation is for somebody for whom there has been a long, a long history maybe of love and care, who made a careless mistake. I mean, maybe you can be reconciled with that, but people with a pattern of really violent behavior, of doing terrible things consistently, how can you be reconciled with those people? And women are sometimes put into situations, often through the courts and through legal means, of you have to go through this reconciliation process before we even consider taking any action against this person who did terrible things to you. I think it's a terrible thing. I mean, it doesn't benefit women at all.
No.
Yeah.
There's been very serious feminist critiques of reconciliation in all kinds of situations. It's true. I'd just like to say something else. I see somebody saying something in the chat. A couple of women are saying things about therapy. The other thing that Louise Armstrong says in her book, Rocking the Cradle, is that, of course, the feminist therapy industry provided jobs for women, often jobs for which they needed no training at all, and in which they could feel they were helping women. But as a result of doing that, and it became a massive source of employment, there's huge numbers of women being therapists. And it should be said that Diana Russell wrote splendidly in a paper. She is the wonderful American radical feminist who's written about incest, child sexual abuse, rape in marriage, and so on. She said that women go to therapy, men go to prostitutes. So isn't it interesting that there's such a difference in the situation? But anyway, the therapy for incest created a huge industry in which women could actually make money, which is good, without having to be in the world of men's work. But they became, particularly in the US, maybe not so much, I think, in Britain, the high priests. They were the high priests of feminism. The therapists took on a sort of power because they had power over women's souls. They were in receipt of secrets and put them in a particular position, which I think was potentially problematic as well. So I don't know exactly what's going on with all of this now, but we don't have a critique of therapy. We don't have a critique of the concept of mental illness. In the feminism that's happening at the moment, it's very, very, very limited in its scope. And we don't really talk about those things that we used to talk and write and so on about in the old days.
Yeah, it's fixing women rather than challenging the system. Yeah. Somebody put in the chat that they would counsel women to stay away from men. So that's probably the best bit of counselling. And of course, now the other thing that is sort of part of the backlash against this is young women that have been abused and then think they can get away from that by becoming men. And the therapy industry kind of enables that, doesn't it? Because it'll say they have something called gender dysphoria, and that means that
therapy has created
the
transgendering of children, which is utterly shocking.
Yeah. But that's just another way where therapy is harmful to women because it's encouraging ideas about gender, and there's another thing in the chat where somebody had a reconciliation sort of session with her abuser, a family member, who said he didn't understand that she hadn't enjoyed it. It's terrible.
I mean, I would like to see a whole movement where men are made to understand the answer is no before you even ask anything. That if you are about to approach a woman for anything, start with no, and the goal is not to get to yes. The goal is to just have you get to know. The answer is no. I mean, when I was, a young lesbian and men would start to talk to me, I'm like, I don't know what you're going to ask and I don't care, but the answer is no before you even ask, and that's never going to change. And I said, and I will kill you, or at least rip your balls off if you try to convince me otherwise. And I hate to say that's the only thing that men understand, but maybe it is, I don't know. But the idea of the answer is no before you even ask.
Yeah, a lot of women aren't encouraged as they're brought up as girls to have that kind of self-confidence, have they? you know, to be able to say no. You know, I think that's something, yeah, girls need to be taught from a young age. Say no. You have the right, you have rights, but they're not. Somebody's raised their hand, but could you put the question in the chat or in the Q&A, please? If you, because we've only got a few minutes left now. There's a lot of interesting things in the chat about women's experience of therapy, some helpful, some not helpful, and somebody who lost a friend to suicide because the therapy hadn't helped. She hadn't been able, you know, hadn't helped her deal with what had happened to her. It is really, really terrible what happens.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting that there is such criticism of therapy in the chat. There's quite a lot of interesting comments, and yet we don't have this discussion as feminists. It's not out there, and of course we should be there. And that's because therapy is so privatizing and individualizing. You're never supposed to discuss your therapy with anybody. The therapists are supposed to pretend they don't know you in the street. It's this secret experience that you have. And I think this is partly what's meaning that we are not having a discussion of this phenomenon, which is hugely important for women, hugely important for women.
I mean, there's a question in the chat, or how do girls and women find some personal healing? You know, for me, it's a question of community. Women's community is just separatism, being separate from men. Now, I can say that as a lesbian because I can try and find and, you know, have women's only community. I don't know how heterosexual women do that and continue personal relationships, but outside of the immediate, you know, family personal relationships, separatism, women's community, it is so different. Once you start repeatedly, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, being in community on a regular basis with only women, that makes a huge difference. It makes a tremendous amount of difference because women start saying like, oh my God, I didn't know that I could, you know, talk to people like this. And oh my God, I didn't know that women could do, you know, these things for each other. I didn't know. So I think that the only real solution, the only one that I've seen that works, is some measure of separatism in a woman's life where she regularly is in community with only other women.
We've got a couple of final questions put up. We might be able to just say a little bit about them. Somebody's saying no is not helpful. It's a power dynamic. A child can't say no. Do you agree? And somebody asking about the proposed inquiry on the grooming gangs. She says, I worry it'll be conducted in the same patriarchal way and will be a huge waste of money that will just make the situation worse for women and girls. So any final comments on those? No, it's it's too maybe.
No, I mean, yeah, when you're a little kid, I mean, you don't know. I mean, you don't know. And that's, you know, that's the kind of thing that Sandra was talking about is, you know, when it starts in childhood and a child, you know, thinks that, oh, this is just the way it is. They don't know how awful it is. They don't know how completely beyond the pale it is. When you start to find out and are able to say no, you know, that's a different question. And I get it. I mean, I totally get it when it's a little kid. Grooming gangs try and make it so that a child never learns to say no. Hopefully that as girls grow up, we start learning. It's like, you know, this sucks, or you meet other girls who just like, what do you mean? And talk about it. But again, being able to be in community with only other women, I think really helps with that.
Yeah. I got just one comment. When I was teaching sort of 16, 17-year-olds in Hammersmith and West London College in London back in the 1980s, I was teaching history. So I actually taught the Punishment of Incest Act 1908, or at least I mentioned it. And in the corridor afterwards, immediately after the lecture, a girl came up to me and she said, Miss Jeffries, is incest illegal? So I knew what was happening to her. But what was extraordinary was that it wasn't known. And that must still be the case. It must still be the case. These girls do not know what the law is, and why would they? And I reckon that must still be the case. How often is the Punishment of Incest Act being taught to girls?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe the publicity around what's going on with grooming gangs might help some girls realise that what's happening isn't right. But yeah, there's no easy solutions. I think that's the problem with a discussion like this. The hour comes up and we've raised lots of questions and lots of problems, but solutions are much, much harder to find. But we keep having these discussions and we keep on with whatever activism that we're doing, then let's hope that starts to make the difference.
Thanks very much,
take us a
Sandra,
long
for talking
time
about this and bringing up this whole topic.
Thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, so thank you, Sandra, Sheila, Marion, and everybody in the chat, because it's been fascinating. Bye.